Rod Stewart had everything a man could ever want: fame, money, sold-out arenas, and a line of beautiful women that seemed like it would never end. But here is the thing about a man who has it all. Sometimes the one thing he truly needed was the one thing he let walk right out the door. And recently, Rod Stewart did something that surprised a lot of people. He made a confession that most rock legends would never dare to say out loud. He admitted there was one woman in his life he should never have let go. One woman who left a mark so deep that even after decades, even after 3 marriages and 8 children, her name still finds a way back to his lips. And when you hear the full story of how that happened, and everything that came before it, you will completely understand why that confession hit the people who heard it so hard. Now, before we get to who she is, and why Stewart finally said what he said, you need to understand something important. This is not just a love story. This is the story of a man who spent 60 years running from the one thing he was always searching for. A man who had more chances at real love than most people get in 3 lifetimes, and still managed to let the most important one slip away. And when you see the full picture, laid out from the very beginning, that confession of his hits completely differently than you would expect. Rod Stewart was born on January 10, 1945, in North London, right in the middle of World War II. Britain was tired, bruised, and deeply uncertain about what the future held. But inside the Stewart home, things felt surprisingly warm and full of life. His father worked in construction, his mother stayed home with the children, and Rod, the youngest of 5, was basically the golden child of the entire family. He was spoiled, deeply loved, and carefully protected from the harder edges of the world just outside their front door. Rod himself later said that his childhood was fantastically happy, and that happiness, believe it or not, actually made certain things harder for him later in life. Because when you grow up wrapped in that much comfort and attention, the real world eventually lands like a cold shock you were never quite prepared for. 2 things ruled the Stewart household above everything else: soccer and music. On the soccer field, Rod was aggressive, competitive, and genuinely talented in a way that turned heads. People around him genuinely believed he had a real shot at making it professionally one day. But music was pulling at him with equal force. The family deeply loved American singer Al Jolson, but the artist who truly flipped a switch inside young Rod was Little Richard. The wild energy, the raw untamed voice, the pure swagger of the man completely grabbed him and would not let go. His father, noticing just how obsessed his youngest son had become, eventually bought him his very first guitar, without fully realizing what kind of future he was placing in those young hands. By the time Rod was 15 years old, he made a decision that would have frightened most parents straight to their core. He dropped out of school to chase a career in professional soccer. School had never felt right for him anyway. He clashed constantly with teachers, struggled deeply to connect with academic structure, and eventually got himself caned before finally walking away from the classroom for good. He left with no qualifications, no real plan, and a whole lot of belief in himself. He earned a tryout with Brentford FC, a 3rd division club at the time. And for years afterward, people assumed the club had genuinely been interested in signing him. Rod later admitted the truth was considerably harsher than that. After the tryout, they simply never called him back. Not once. Not even a polite rejection. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Rod was not completely destroyed by that rejection. Because deep down, there was another reason he had always been drawn more toward music than sports. He loved to party. In his own mind, being a musician meant living a lifestyle far more forgiving than grinding through the discipline of professional athletics. Singing seemed like the one career path where staying out late and drinking heavily would not automatically tear everything down around him. So he made his pivot toward music and never looked back. The problem was that dreaming about being a rock star does not pay rent. Rod started working at his father's newspaper stand, hauling papers around London every morning while still secretly believing deep in his bones that he was destined for something far bigger than this. He bounced from job to job after that, each one stranger than the last. He tried screen printing at a wallpaper company, which actually seemed reasonably promising at first, until he discovered he was colorblind. For someone working in wallpaper printing, that was about as catastrophic a discovery as he could have made. He trained briefly as an electrician, worked with picture frames, and eventually found himself working at Highgate Cemetery. And then, as if that was not already strange enough, things got even darker. He spent time working inside a funeral home, surrounded daily by grief, silence, and loss, while still quietly and stubbornly dreaming of sold-out concerts and screaming fans calling his name. Even through every single one of those strange day tours, he never once let go of music. At 16, he joined a band called the Raiders and landed an audition with legendary producer Joe Meek, one of the most powerful names in British music at the time. This was supposed to be his moment, the door finally cracking open. Instead, it became one of the most humiliating experiences of his young life. Meek heard Rod singing and completely lost his composure. He stormed into the studio, covered his ears, and screamed at Rod to stop until he packed up and left the room entirely. It was brutal. The kind of public rejection that breaks a lot of young people and sends them home for good. But history later proved that Joe Meek's musical judgment was far from reliable. The same man also passed on David Bowie and famously dismissed the Beatles as nothing more than irritating noise. That knowledge probably did not ease the sting much at the time, but it is certainly worth remembering when thinking about how close Rod came to giving up entirely. Rod drifted into London's counterculture scene after that rejection. He got involved in anti-nuclear protests, surrounded himself with activists and beatniks, and threw himself into a communal lifestyle filled with late nights, rebellion, and restless energy. He later admitted with a wide grin that his real motivation for attending all those protests was simply to meet women. And right in the middle of that chaotic chapter of his life, he did meet someone. Someone who would change his story in ways neither of them could have seen coming, though not in the way either of them probably hoped it would go. In 1962, 17-year-old Rod Stewart met an artist named Susanna Boffey at a nightclub, and things moved fast almost immediately. They were young, reckless, completely swept up in the electric energy of London's music and nightlife scene. But before long, Susanna discovered she was pregnant. And Rod, barely old enough to truly understand what that news meant, did the one thing he would spend the rest of his life quietly carrying with him. He walked away. Backed by his family, he pulled back completely and left Susanna to face everything entirely on her own. What followed for Susanna was nothing short of heartbreaking. Her landlord found out she was unmarried and pregnant and evicted her without hesitation. She ended up in a home for unwed teenage mothers, doing hard physical labor in exchange for a roof over her head. She gave birth alone at Whittington Hospital in November 1963. Rod did eventually show up after the birth, but not to step into the role of a father. Instead, he made a proposal that was almost impossible to believe. He asked Susanna to give the baby up for adoption, so the two of them could simply carry on dating as before. She eventually did place the child for adoption, but it had absolutely nothing to do with saving any relationship. That was already gone. The baby girl, who would come to be known as Sarah, would not find her way back into Rod's life until 2007, when she walked into his Los Angeles recording studio and quietly introduced herself as his daughter. By then, Rod's face had been hanging on her bedroom wall her entire childhood without her ever knowing the truth. Decades later, Rod released a song called Brighton Beach and described it publicly as a tribute to a real woman from his past. When Susanna heard it, she was furious. The song wrapped their story in soft, romantic nostalgia and even suggested her father had played a role in pulling them apart. Susanna remembered things in an entirely different light. In her version, Rod simply abandoned her the moment she told him she was carrying his child. For Rod, it had become a memory wrapped in sentiment and longing. For Susanna, that beach was the place where her entire world had fallen apart around her. While that painful chapter closed behind him, Rod threw himself deeper into music with everything he had. He busked on London streets, teamed up with folk singer Wiz Jones, traveled through Paris and Barcelona, and lived the kind of rough, wandering, hand-to-mouth life that struggling young musicians knew intimately. Barcelona brought real trouble. Living under bridges, barely surviving from one day to the next, local authorities eventually decided Rod looked far more like a vagrant than any kind of working artist, and had him deported from the country entirely. Still, nothing could pull him away from music for long. He picked up the harmonica and eventually landed a spot in a band called The Dimensions. And while performing with that group, he found himself sharing venues with the Rolling Stones. Standing backstage, watching Mick Jagger command an entire crowd with nothing but his presence and energy, something shifted permanently and deeply inside Rod Stewart. He did not just want to be a singer anymore. He wanted to be a rock star. By 1964, though, success still felt impossibly far away. He was still busking at Twickenham railway station, playing harmonica for spare change from strangers, when musician Long John Baldry happened to walk past and actually stopped to listen. Baldry was impressed enough to invite Rod to join his band. Then he heard him sing and immediately realized there was something genuinely rare and powerful there. From that moment, doors began opening in ways they never had before. Rod eventually joined the Jeff Beck Group, then became part of Faces in 1969, all while quietly and relentlessly building a solo career alongside everything else. It was an exhausting grind by any measure, but Rod absolutely thrived on it. And eventually, all that grinding exploded into the kind of mainstream success that very few artists in history ever get to experience. Songs like Tonight's the Night and DAYA Think I'm Sexy turned him into one of the biggest and most recognizable rock stars of the entire 1970s. The fame brought everything he had ever let himself imagine: money, parties, celebrity circles, and the kind of constant attention from beautiful women that most men could never dream of. His romantic life during those years became almost legendary for its chaos and scale. He had a passionate relationship with Swedish actress Britt Ekland, whose fire and energy directly inspired his biggest American hit. He had a brief but memorable romance with actress Joanna Lumley, who later admitted she had absolutely no idea who he was when they first met. He eventually married model Alana Collins in 1979, had 2 children with her, and then tore the marriage apart by beginning a relationship with Sports Illustrated model Kelly Emberg while still very much married. Alana later admitted the breakup shattered her completely, and that the fact Emberg was 15 years younger only made everything feel worse. Rod, in his own words, admitted plainly that he had always been a coward when it came to ending relationships. He never handled those moments the way he should have. Through all of it, a pattern had become completely impossible to ignore. Rod Stewart had a very clear type: tall, blonde, and glamorous. And he was almost constitutionally incapable of slowing down long enough to fully invest in what he already had standing right in front of him. Then came Rachel Hunter, and everything that followed her would change the way Rod Stewart understood himself. In the late 1980s, Rod met New Zealand model Rachel Hunter at a nightclub in Los Angeles. She was 21 years old, absolutely stunning, and more than 2 decades younger than him. She was already in a relationship when they first met, but once she got to know Rod, things moved with breathtaking speed. Just 3 months after meeting, they were married. Rod became genuinely convinced, for the first time in a very long time, that this one was different. That Rachel was the woman he would finally and truly settle down with. The couple welcomed daughter Renee in 1992 and son Liam in 1994. And unlike everything most people later assumed about how it ended, it was not Rod who destroyed this marriage. By his own account, given consistently over many years, Rachel Hunter was the one woman he never cheated on. Not even once. But in 1999, Rachel walked away anyway. She was exhausted, tired of the noise, the constant circus, the relentless chaos that came with being married to one of the most famous men on earth. She wanted something quieter, something that felt more like a real and ordinary life. And her decision broke Rod Stewart in a way that very few things in his life ever truly had. He later admitted openly that the end of his marriage to Rachel tore him apart emotionally in ways he had not expected and was not prepared for. He believed their significant age gap had always been a quiet ticking clock waiting for its moment. Rachel herself later agreed, speaking honestly about the breakdown and acknowledging that her youth had played a massive role in what ultimately happened between them. That 6-month stretch after the split was dark and genuinely painful for Rod. He later joked that he made the most of his freedom during those months, but underneath all the humor was real and unguarded heartbreak that people close to him could see clearly. His bass player had actually gotten hold of a photographer named Penny Lancaster's phone number around that time and deliberately held onto it for 6 full months, convinced that Rod needed time and space before jumping straight into another serious relationship. Rod later admitted his bandmate was almost certainly right about that. But once he finally connected with Penny, something clicked that he had not felt in a long time. She was tall, confident, striking, and grounded in a way that felt genuinely different. He took her shopping at Dolce & Gabbana early in their relationship and spent roughly $12,000 in a single afternoon, then told her she could only wear the new clothes when they were together. Unusual, yes. But Penny stayed. They married, welcomed 2 sons. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Rod Stewart seemed like a man who had genuinely found his peace. But even with all that happiness surrounding him, the past had a remarkable way of finding him when he least expected it. In 2007, while working inside a Los Angeles recording studio, a receptionist called upstairs with an unexpected message. A young woman was downstairs and was claiming to be his daughter. Rod assumed immediately it had to be some kind of scam and sent his bandmate Jim Cregan down to investigate before agreeing to meet her himself. The moment Cregan saw her face, every doubt he had vanished instantly. She looked exactly like Rod Stewart. She was Sarah, the daughter Rod had walked away from all those decades ago when Susanna Boffey needed him most. Sarah's life had not been easy by any measure. She had struggled with addiction and deep emotional pain before finally learning the truth about her biological father from her adoptive parents. She had spent her entire childhood with Rod's face on her bedroom wall, without ever knowing who he actually was to her. After the death of her adoptive mother, she finally worked up the courage to reach out. Their first meetings were awkward and loaded with the weight of unanswered decades. But slowly and carefully, over time, she became a recognized and accepted part of the wider Stewart family. Now here is where everything truly comes full circle. During a recent interview with The Times, Rod Stewart sat with his memories and reflected on all of it. The marriages, the heartbreaks, the chaos, the women, the years. And when the conversation turned toward Rachel Hunter, something honest and completely unguarded came through in the way he spoke. He talked about how the end of that marriage had devastated him more than he had let on publicly at the time. He talked about the empty 6 months that followed. He talked about the age gap, the early warnings from his own family, and the way Rachel herself had eventually come to understand why the marriage simply could not survive the distance between where they each needed to go. And beneath every word, one truth sat quietly and unmistakably at the center of everything. Rachel Hunter was the woman Rod Stewart believed he should never have let go. The one relationship where he had genuinely done everything right, stayed faithful, showed up fully, built something real, and still lost her in the end anyway. There is something quietly and deeply devastating about that reality. A man who spent the better part of his adult life making the wrong choices, chasing the next thrill, running from commitment, and leaving people behind finally gets it right with one woman. He stays. He is faithful. He builds a real family and does all the things he never did before with anyone else. And she still leaves. Not because of anything he did wrong that time, but because of the world he built around himself for so long before she ever arrived in it. Rod Stewart found real love again with Penny Lancaster. He found something lasting and stable and genuinely good. But when the music fades and he sits quietly with his own memories, it is Rachel Hunter who rises to the surface. The one he finally got right. The one who still left. And maybe that is the most human and achingly honest thing about Rod Stewart's entire story. Not the arenas, not the anthems, not the decades of beautiful chaos, but the simple and painful truth that even when you finally become the man you were always supposed to be, the right person can still slip through your hands. And you spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been different if the clock had just been a little kinder to both of you.